His name should not have existed inside her jet. Mason Cole wiped engine grease across denim, Dallas heat pressing through hangar steel, when the black box playback murmured syllables that matched his driver's license exactly. Aurora Sterling descended her jet stairs like winter in heels, shock whitening her executive mask as the recording looped. His name, her altitude, a past neither could grasp, but both had somehow survived. The single father's wrench slipped, the CEO's breath caught. Between them, the aircraft hummed with secrets that would demand everything they'd rebuilt from nothing. Subscribe now, because when truth takes flight, no one lands unchanged. The Dallas hangar tasted of burnt metal and broken promises, the kind of place where men disappeared into their work because facing what waited at home required a courage Mason Cole had depleted years ago. He stood beneath the Gulfstream's starboard engine at 11:47 on a Thursday night, forearms slick with hydraulic fluid, the fluorescent strips overhead flickering in rhythms that matched his exhausted heartbeat. His daughter Lily would be asleep by now in their two-bedroom apartment across town, her math homework spread across the kitchen table he'd sworn he'd check before midnight. Another vow dissolving into the chemical smell of aviation fuel and the perpetual hum of machinery that had become his lullaby and his prison. The wrench in his palm felt heavier than it should. 38 years of gravity accumulating in tempered steel, and he wondered, not for the first time, if this was what drowning felt like. Slow, industrial, suffocating in increments so small you didn't notice until your lungs were full of everything except air. Other mechanics had clocked out hours ago, their laughter fading into the Texas night. But Mason stayed because the overtime check meant new sneakers for Lily and maybe, just maybe, enough left over to stop the landlord's increasingly hostile text messages that arrived like small detonations throughout his day. The Gulfstream belonged to someone important. That much the work order made clear. Corporate registration numbers that spoke of boardrooms and decisions made at altitudes where oxygen thinned and ordinary lives became abstractions on quarterly reports. His knuckles scraped against a bolt head as he adjusted the torque specification, blood welling in a thin line across weathered skin, and he didn't flinch because pain had become white noise. Another frequency in the static of survival. The black box sat in its housing near the cockpit access panel, an orange rectangle of compressed memory and regulatory requirement, and Mason had learned years ago not to wonder about the lives that intersected with these machines, the executives and their urgencies, the destinations that meant power shifts and market movements, while he remained earthbound, calibrating thrust ratios and checking fuel line integrity for $17 an hour plus overtime. But tonight, something pulled his attention toward that recorder. A magnetism he couldn't name, his reflection fragmenting across its sealed casing as if the device itself were trying to show him a version of Mason Cole that didn't exist in the mirror anymore, if it ever had. He told himself it was exhaustion, the way consciousness frayed at its edges when you'd been awake since 5:30, and the only meal was a gas station sandwich eaten standing over a parts catalogue. But his hand moved anyway, reaching for the playback interface that mechanics weren't supposed to access without direct authorization from the aviation authority or the aircraft owner. Protocol was a luxury for people who didn't have a 9-year-old asking why her mom never called, why their apartment smelled like mildew, why other kids had fathers who attended recitals instead of arriving 3 hours late, with grease still embedded under their fingernails like a confession of inadequacy. The playback system activated with a digital chirp that seemed too loud in the hangar's vast emptiness, and Mason's thumb hovered over the stop button, some instinct screaming that certain doors once opened could never be sealed again. But curiosity or fate, or just the simple human need to hear something other than his own thoughts in this metal cavern, made him press play, and the cockpit voice recording began its dispassionate chronology of altitude and heading. The pilot's voice, professional and distant, reciting numbers that charted a journey Mason would never take, describing weather patterns and air traffic vectors that belonged to a world he serviced but did not inhabit. He should have stopped there, should have closed the system and returned to the engine calibration that was his actual job, but something in the recording's background caught his attention. A voice, female, speaking too low for the words to resolve into meaning, followed by the pilot's response about passenger comfort and estimated arrival time. Mason increased the volume, leaning closer to the black box, as if proximity could translate the static into sense. And then he heard it, clear as the blood in his veins, clear as Lily's laugh when she didn't know he was listening, clear as the absence where his wife used to sleep before she decided motherhood and marriage were cages she needed to escape. And what he heard was impossible. His own name, spoken by a woman he'd never met, at an altitude he'd never reached, on a date the system timestamp placed as 3 years ago, when his life was different but equally broken, just in different configurations of despair. Mason Cole stumbled backward, the wrench clattering against concrete, his pulse spiking into his throat where it lodged like an accusation. The recording continued its loop, indifferent to his crisis, and he heard his name again. This time followed by numbers that might have been coordinates or account codes, or the kind of data that connected people in ways legal documents and digital trails could verify or destroy, depending on who asked the questions. His hands shook as he stopped the playback, his breath coming in short gasps that fogged the instrument panel. And he thought about Lily, waking up to find him gone, not to the hangar but to someplace darker, the kind of vanishing that happened to people who learned things they weren't supposed to know, whose names appeared in recordings they had no memory of creating. The paranoia tasted like copper, like fear made physical, and he forced himself to think rationally, to construct explanations that didn't require conspiracies or hidden pasts. Maybe he'd worked on this aircraft before. Maybe some maintenance log had audio notes he'd forgotten. Maybe the universe was just indifferent enough to put his common name into a random recording, and his exhausted brain was pattern-seeking where only chaos existed. But none of those explanations could account for the specificity, the way his full name had been pronounced, the cadence suggesting familiarity rather than coincidence. And beneath his ribs, something ancient and animal understood, that his life had just pivoted on an axis he couldn't see, that the hangar's shadows had deepened in ways that had nothing to do with the failing fluorescent tubes overhead. He saved the audio file to his phone, fingers fumbling across the cracked screen protector, breaking at least 4 company policies and possibly several federal regulations. But the alternative was letting this moment dissolve into hangar mythology. The kind of story other mechanics would dismiss over coffee as stress-induced hallucination or equipment malfunction. The download completed just as headlights swept through the hangar entrance, high beams cutting through oil-stained air, and Mason's first instinct was to run, to grab his tools and disappear into the Dallas night, before whoever owned this aircraft and this recording could connect him to the theft he'd just committed. But his legs wouldn't move, some deeper paralysis holding him in place as a Blacktown car pulled to a stop 30 feet away, its engine purring with the kind of mechanical perfection Mason spent his nights chasing, but never quite achieved in the used vehicles he kept running through sheer stubbornness and YouTube tutorials. The driver's door opened, but no one emerged immediately, just the interior light spilling out like an invitation or a threat, and Mason stood there holding his phone with its stolen audio file, his name echoing in his skull, wondering if the next voice he heard would offer explanation or accusation, redemption or ruin. The moment stretched, eternal and suffocating, Dallas humidity pressing through the hangar's open bay like a physical presence, and Mason Cole understood with sudden clarity that his life, such as it was, had just ended, not with violence or drama, but with the simple mechanical fact of his name existing where it should not, spoken by a woman he was about to meet, whose footsteps now clicked against concrete with the inevitability of consequence. Aurora Sterling emerged from the town car like winter descending on a landscape unprepared for its severity, her presence immediately contracting the hangar's vast space into something claustrophobic and charged with the electricity that preceded thunderstorms in the Texas plains. She wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Mason's monthly rent, its lines engineered to convey authority without aggression, though the distinction seemed academic when her gaze swept the hangar with the assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating assets and liabilities in milliseconds, filing human beings into spreadsheets of utility or irrelevance. Her heels struck concrete in a rhythm that suggested military precision softened by decades of corporate combat, each step measured and deliberate, and Mason found himself cataloguing details against his will. The slight asymmetry in her stride favoring her left leg, the way her right hand remained in her jacket pocket as if gripping something for stability or defense. The exhaustion carved into the fine lines around her eyes that expensive skincare couldn't fully erase. She was 41 according to the registration documents he'd seen, but in this light, she looked both younger and older, her face a battlefield where ambition had won most skirmishes, but was slowly losing the war to whatever kept her awake at night, staring at Dallas's glittering skyline from glass towers that promised everything and delivered only the hollow echo of achievement without meaning. Her driver remained in the vehicle, a silent sentinel whose presence spoke of security protocols and the paranoia that accompanied wealth at certain altitudes. And Aurora approached Mason without preamble or pleasantries, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that felt like exposure, as if she could see not just his grease-stained uniform and exhausted posture, but the architecture of his failures, the topography of his compromises, the exact dimensions of the space where Hope used to live before Lily's mother left, and the bills started arriving with red text and final warnings. She stopped 6 feet away, maintaining a distance that felt both professional and profoundly intimate, close enough that Mason could smell her perfume. Something expensive and cold, cedar and bergamot, the olfactory signature of boardrooms where futures were decided and fortunes redistributed according to logics that had nothing to do with justice or need. Her voice when she spoke was smoke and silk, each word enunciated with the precision of someone who'd learned early that language was a weapon more reliable than emotion, that in the upper atmosphere of corporate warfare, sentiment was a vulnerability to be excised or exploited depending on tactical advantage. She asked if he was Mason Cole, though her tone suggested she already knew that this wasn't a question but rather the opening move in a negotiation whose terms he didn't yet understand. And he found himself nodding because speech required a coherence he couldn't currently access. His vocal cords paralyzed by the simple strangeness of standing before the woman whose voice he'd just heard speaking his name from 3 years in the past. Aurora's expression didn't change at his confirmation, no surprise or relief or accusation registering on features trained to reveal nothing unless revelation served a strategic purpose. And Mason understood he was facing someone who'd built empires by knowing more than she showed, by letting others fill silences with confessions while she simply waited and watched and catalogued their weaknesses for future use. She asked if he'd accessed the black box, and the question landed like a physical blow, confirming that she knew that somehow, despite the empty hangar and the late hour and his certainty of privacy, his actions had been observed or predicted or simply assumed because people like her didn't survive at the top without developing instincts that bordered on precognition when it came to threats and opportunities. Mason considered lying, considered claiming ignorance or confusion, but something in her eyes suggested that deception would be not just futile, but actively dangerous, that the only currency he possessed in this moment was honesty, however damning. So he nodded again, his hand involuntarily moving to the phone in his pocket, where the audio file waited like evidence or ammunition, depending on who controlled the narrative. And he waited for her response. Termination. Legal action, the kind of consequences that cascaded through working-class lives, with the efficiency of dominoes falling in slow motion toward homelessness and desperation. But Aurora didn't threaten or dismiss him, didn't summon her driver, or reach for her own phone to call security or corporate counsel, and her restraint felt more terrifying than any overt aggression, because it suggested depths of calculation Mason couldn't fathom, strategies operating on timescales and dimensions he lacked the education or experience to recognize. Instead, she asked what he'd heard, and the question's simplicity contained multitudes, inviting confession, while simultaneously testing whether he'd understood the significance of what the recording contained, whether his name's presence in her aircraft's memory had resonated with the same seismic force in his consciousness as it apparently had in hers. Mason's mouth went dry, his tongue feeling foreign and clumsy, and he forced out the words that would either explain everything or destroy what remained of his precarious existence. He told her he'd heard his name, spoken by someone who sounded like her, in a conversation he had no memory of participating in. On a date when he'd been nowhere near any airport or aircraft or the rarefied spaces where people like her conducted their business. The confession hung between them like smoke from a wreckage neither could yet see clearly, and Aurora's composure cracked just slightly, a hairline fracture in the executive facade, her left hand rising to touch her throat in a gesture that might have been protective or simply automatic, the unconscious response of someone confronting an impossibility that violated the ordered reality she'd constructed through sheer force of will and ruthless competence. She said his name then, not asking but stating it as if testing its weight on her tongue, and the sound of it, his ordinary, unremarkable name, transformed in her pronunciation into something strange and significant, a key that might unlock doors neither of them had known existed or wanted opened. Aurora asked if he remembered Dallas 3 years ago, late April, a Thursday evening, and Mason's mind raced through that period of his life, trying to locate some event or encounter that would explain the connection. But that spring was a blur of double shifts, and Lily's parent-teacher conferences, and his wife's increasingly frequent absences that preceded her final departure by only months. He told Aurora he remembered nothing unusual, just work and fatherhood and the slow-motion collapse of his marriage, and her expression shifted into something that might have been disappointment or relief or both, her eyes searching his face as if the truth might be written in the lines around his mouth, or the stubble he hadn't had time to shave, or the exhaustion that had become his permanent condition. She stepped closer then, closing the distance between them until Mason could see the fine grain of her skin, the nearly invisible scar at her left temple, the way her pupils dilated slightly as if she were simultaneously drawn toward and repelled by his proximity, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional armor, revealing beneath it something raw and uncertain, almost human in its vulnerability. Aurora said she didn't remember either, not clearly. Just fragments and sensations that surface sometimes in the moments between waking and sleep. Images that felt like memories but lacked the narrative coherence that separated experience from imagination. She described a hangar much like this one, engine noise and chemical smells. A conversation that felt urgent but whose content dissolved the moment she tried to grasp it. And underneath everything, a sense of danger that had nothing to do with mechanical failure or corporate competition, but something more primal, more personal, the kind of threat that lived in the body's memory even when the mind couldn't access the files. Mason listened and felt his reality tilting, the familiar hangar suddenly strange, the woman before him both a stranger and somehow known, as if his cells recognized what his consciousness refused to acknowledge. And he thought about quantum mechanics, about particles that could be in two places simultaneously until observation forced them into singular existence, and wondered if his life had somehow bifurcated into parallel streams that were only now, in this charged Dallas night, beginning to merge back into a single terrifying present. Aurora reached into her pocket and extracted her phone, her movements slow and deliberate, and for a moment Mason tensed, expecting police or security, but instead she showed him a photograph, a document, faded and slightly out of focus, with text he couldn't quite read at this distance, but signatures clearly visible at the bottom. And one of those signatures, she said softly, was his, dated 3 years ago, witnessed and notarized, connected to a transaction or agreement or event that neither of them could remember, but that someone, somewhere, had ensured was legally binding and thoroughly documented. A paper trail leading backward into the fog of their respective pasts and forward into consequences that were only beginning to reveal their shape. The photograph on Aurora's phone screen glowed in the hangar's dim light, like an artifact from an alternate dimension, the document's official seals and legal language transforming Mason's phone into a window onto a past that felt simultaneously impossible and inevitable, as if the universe had been constructing this moment for years while he remained oblivious, focused on oil changes and Lily's spelling tests and the 1,000 small emergencies that defined working poverty. He reached for the device with trembling fingers, and Aurora allowed the contact, her hand briefly touching his in a transfer that sent an unexpected current through his nervous system, something between recognition and warning. And he wondered if she felt it too. That strange electricity that had nothing to do with attraction in any conventional sense, and everything to do with two damaged people standing at the edge of revelations that might destroy whatever fragile stability they'd managed to construct. The document was dense with legal terminology that Mason's exhausted brain struggled to parse. Clauses about liabilities and indemnifications, and parties of the first and second part, but his eyes locked onto his signature at the bottom, a scrawl that looked authentically his, complete with the characteristic way his capital M looped backward slightly, a quirk he'd developed in 3rd grade and never corrected. The date read April 27th, 3 years prior, a Thursday evening according to the timestamp, and Mason's memory offered nothing except the vague recollection of another shift, another night when Lily had eaten dinner alone while he worked overtime to keep their lives from completely unraveling. Aurora's voice cut through his concentration, asking if he recognized the signature, and Mason found himself nodding even as denial screamed through every rational corridor of his mind, because that signature was his, unmistakably, undeniably, and yet he had no memory of signing this document or any document, no recollection of meeting Aurora Sterling or being in any situation that would require legal contracts and notarized agreements. She explained that the document was a non-disclosure agreement, standard corporate boilerplate according to her legal team, connected to some consulting work her company had commissioned, though the specific details were redacted in this version, classified according to proprietary information protocols that her lawyers had insisted upon. But what troubled her, what had brought her to this hangar at midnight when she should have been preparing for a board meeting that would determine her company's next quarter and possibly her continued tenure as chief executive, was that she had no memory of commissioning any work that would require a mechanic's involvement. No record in her calendar or email archives or the meticulous notes she kept of every business interaction, every handshake and contract signing that might later prove significant. Her corporate security team had flagged the document during a routine audit. noticed the anomaly of a contract with no corresponding project files. No invoices or deliverables or any of the paper trail that accompanied legitimate business transactions. And when they'd run the name through their systems, Mason Cole had appeared as an employee of the aviation maintenance company that serviced her fleet. His security clearance and employment history utterly ordinary, except for this single impossible document bearing his authentic signature and her company's seal. Mason handed the phone back, his hands numb and clumsy, and asked the question that felt both essential and terrifying. What had they supposedly agreed to? What was this document protecting or concealing? And why would his signature be required on a non-disclosure agreement when his entire professional existence involved fixing engines and calibrating systems, work that generated maintenance logs and punch clocks, but nothing that approached the realm of corporate secrets worth legal protection? Aurora's expression darkened, shadows pooling in the hollows beneath her cheekbones, and she admitted she didn't know that the redactions were so extensive that even she, with her executive access and authority, couldn't penetrate the classification layers her own legal department had apparently constructed. But what she did know, what had kept her awake for the past 72 hours since the document's discovery, was that someone had gone to elaborate lengths to erase context while preserving the contract itself, had stripped away every detail except their signatures and the date, creating a legal shell that proved something had occurred while revealing nothing about what or why or who else might have been involved. The implication hung between them heavy and suffocating, that they'd been used, manipulated, their signatures obtained under circumstances neither could recall, their lives intersecting in ways that someone with power and resources had deemed necessary to simultaneously document and conceal, creating a contradiction that violated every principle of both legal transparency and operational security. Mason felt his stomach drop, the sensation of falling, even though his boots remained planted on concrete, and he thought about the audio file on his phone, his name spoken at altitude, and wondered how many other traces existed of this phantom encounter. How many digital breadcrumbs and paper trails pointed toward a collision between their worlds that his conscious mind refused to acknowledge, but his autonomic nervous system seemed to recognize, flooding his bloodstream with adrenaline and cortisol in preparation for flight or combat. He asked Aurora if she remembered anything else, any sensory detail or emotional residue from that period 3 years ago, and she closed her eyes as if the question required her to dive into water she'd been avoiding, her breath slowing into something approaching meditation, or maybe just the desperate focus of someone trying to retrieve data from corrupted memory banks. When she spoke, her voice had changed, become younger somehow, less armored, and she described waking up on certain mornings with unexplained bruises on her arms, small circular marks like fingerprints, and a metallic taste in her mouth that reminded her of blood or fear, or the particular flavor of adrenaline when danger became immediate and physical. She mentioned missing hours, gaps in her calendar where she should have been in meetings or conference calls, but instead had marked the time as blocked without explanation, and emails she'd apparently sent to herself containing only coordinates and timestamps, digital notes, in her own words, that she couldn't remember composing and didn't understand upon rediscovery. The pattern Aurora described matched experiences Mason had dismissed as stress or exhaustion. Nights when he'd arrived home later than his shift should have lasted with no clear memory of the intervening time, just a vague sense of having been somewhere important and dangerous and now forbidden, his clothes smelling of chemicals he didn't recognize, and his muscles aching in configurations that didn't match his usual maintenance work. He'd attributed it to fatigue, to the way consciousness frayed when you pushed past human limits. But listening to Aurora catalogue her own missing pieces, he recognized the same shape of absence, the same architecture of concealment, as if they'd both been edited, their biographies redacted by an intelligence that understood memory could be manipulated, but certain physical and digital traces remained. Artifacts pointing toward truths their minds couldn't access, but their bodies and devices faithfully preserved. Aurora opened her eyes and looked at Mason with an expression that combined vulnerability and calculation in equal measure. The face of someone deciding whether to trust or destroy. And she asked him directly if he wanted to know, if whatever they'd forgotten was worth remembering. Because in her experience, the past only stayed buried when its resurrection would destroy everything the present had built. And sometimes ignorance was the only mercy available to people who'd survived their own histories through strategic amnesia and the discipline of forward motion. Mason thought about Lily sleeping in their apartment, her trust absolute and unquestioning, her belief that her father was exactly who he appeared to be, a mechanic who smelled like engine oil and sometimes missed school events, but who loved her with a ferocity that required no explanation or justification. He thought about the life he'd constructed from the wreckage of his marriage, modest and unstable, but his, built on the foundation of showing up and working and being present in the limited ways his circumstances allowed, and he wondered what excavating this buried past would cost. What kinds of truths were dangerous enough to require memory erasure and legal contracts and the elaborate machinery of concealment that apparently surrounded their forgotten Thursday evening 3 years ago. But even as caution whispered its reasonable arguments, something deeper and more primal refused surrender. Some core of self that couldn't abide not knowing, that understood the shape of his life had been determined by forces he couldn't name, and that continuing in ignorance meant living as a puppet whose strings remained invisible, dancing to music he couldn't hear in service to choreographers he'd never met. So he met Aurora's gaze and nodded, accepting whatever consequences came with this choice. And her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the grim acknowledgement of a fellow soldier accepting a suicide mission, and she said simply that they needed to find the black box's complete records, needed to access the unedited audio from that flight, and whatever other evidence existed in the physical and digital archives, needed to reconstruct their erased Thursday and face whatever truth had been deemed too dangerous for them to consciously carry. And Mason agreed, because the alternative was returning to the comfortable lie of his ordinary life. And he'd just discovered that comfort was another word for the prison he'd been inhabiting without recognizing its bars. Tentar novamente el sacabou? Faça os outros mais curtos, mas continue a te completaros, den chapter quart, daughter of the night shift. Mason's phone vibrated in his pocket at 12:17. Lily's name illuminating the cracked screen with the particular dread that accompanied calls after midnight from a child who should be sleeping, and his heart seized with the instant catastrophic thinking that defined single parenthood, fire, intruder, illness, all the disasters that waited in the margins of working-class existence where safety nets were theoretical and consequences permanent. He answered with Aurora watching, her executive composure fractured by the sudden shift in his attention, and Lily's voice came through small and scared, asking where he was, saying she'd woken up from a nightmare about planes falling and needed him home, needed his physical presence in their shabby apartment, because phone calls couldn't chase away the particular demons that haunted 9-year-old imaginations. Mason's throat tightened with guilt and love in equal measure, his daughter's fear colliding with the revelation he was pursuing, and he told her softly that he'd be home in 30 minutes, that she should check all the locks like he'd taught her and wait in a room with the light on, that nothing bad would happen before he arrived because he wouldn't allow it. A promise he had no authority to make, but offered anyway because that's what fathers did, pretended they could protect against chaos and misfortune through sheer force of will and presence. Lily's breathing steadied on the line, her trust absolute and terrifying, and she made him promise again, needed the verbal contract of his return, and Mason gave it knowing he was choosing her over the mystery Aurora represented, choosing the known obligations of fatherhood over the seductive pull of buried truths and dangerous women who appeared in hangars at midnight with documents that rewrote his history. Aurora understood without explanation, her own face softening into something approaching empathy, and she told Mason to go, to take care of his daughter, that some things mattered more than conspiracies and corporate secrets and the reconstruction of erased encounters. But before he could leave, she gripped his forearm with surprising strength, her manicured fingers pressing into his work-worn skin, and she made him promise they'd continue this, that tomorrow or the next day they'd pursue the evidence together, that he wouldn't disappear into his ordinary life and convince himself this night had been hallucination or mistake, because she couldn't do this alone, couldn't navigate the maze of her own missing memories without someone who shared the absence, who could confirm that the holes in her biography weren't madness, but rather the precise surgical strikes of an intelligence that understood how to unmake consciousness while leaving the body functional. Mason promised, exchanging phone numbers with the surreal formality of strangers who'd just discovered they were co-conspirators in a crime neither remembered committing. And then he was running toward his battered pickup truck, Aurora's perfume still ghost-present in his nostrils, the hangar receding behind him as Dallas spread its neon sprawl across the Texas night, indifferent to revelations and broken sleep and all the small heroisms of parents racing toward frightened children. The drive home was a blur of red lights and anxious acceleration, Mason's mind splitting between Lily's nightmare and Aurora's document, between the immediate crisis of comfort and the larger mystery that had just detonated his understanding of his own past. He thought about the timing, about Lily waking with dreams of falling aircraft on the same night he'd discovered his name in a black box recording, and wondered if consciousness leaked between people somehow, if his daughter's sensitive nervous system had picked up on his disturbance and translated it into her own symbolic language of fear and flight. The apartment building appeared ahead, its shabby facade illuminated by security lights that had been broken for months, and Mason took the stairs two at a time, his lungs burning with the particular panic of a parent imagining worst-case scenarios that always seemed more probable at midnight than they statistically were. Lily met him at the door, her small body colliding with his legs, arms wrapping around his waist with desperate strength, and Mason lifted her easily despite his exhaustion, carried her to the couch where they sat in the blue television light while she described her nightmare in fragments. Metal, screaming, names being called by voices she didn't recognize, the sensation of falling through air that offered no resistance, just endless descent toward impact that never came, waking instead to their empty apartment and the knowledge that her father was somewhere else, unreachable, potentially lost in ways that terrified her without clear reason. Mason held his daughter and lied with practiced gentleness, telling her dreams were just dreams, that planes were safe and he was home and nothing would separate them, that her fears were understandable but unfounded, that the world was manageable and comprehensible, and wouldn't suddenly reveal itself to be stranger and more dangerous than her child's mind suspected. But even as he offered comfort, he wondered if Lily somehow knew more than he did. If children's nightmares sometimes predicted rather than reflected, if her unconscious had detected the seismic shift in their reality before his adult mind could process the implications. She fell asleep eventually against his chest, her breathing evening into the deep rhythms of childhood rest, and Mason sat there in the dark apartment thinking about Aurora Sterling and redacted documents and the way his ordinary life had just been revealed as provisional. A story he'd been telling himself that someone else had actually written, using him as a character whose motivations and actions served plots he couldn't access. He checked his phone and found a text from Aurora sent 5 minutes ago. Just coordinates and a time, 2 p.m. tomorrow, an address in downtown Dallas that his map application identified as a private aviation records facility, and beneath the coordinates a single sentence that landed like a stone in still water. Bring your daughter if you must, but come armed with questions because the answers will require courage we might not possess. Mason looked down at Lily sleeping in his arms, her face peaceful now that he'd returned, and understood he was standing at a crossroads where every direction led toward transformation or destruction, where maintaining their fragile stability required ignoring the invitation Aurora represented, but accepting meant potentially exposing his daughter to whatever darkness their erased Thursday contained. He thought about his own father, long dead from a mill accident when Mason was barely older than Lily was now, how that loss had shaped every decision afterward, how he'd vowed to be present and alive and careful in ways his father hadn't managed. And yet here he was, contemplating walking into danger, because not knowing felt worse than any external threat, because living in ignorance meant living as someone else's instrument. And he wanted Lily to inherit a father who'd chosen his path, even if that path led through darkness, rather than one who'd simply accepted whatever story others wrote for him. So he made his decision there, on that shabby couch with his daughter, breathing softly against his chest, decided he would meet Aurora tomorrow and pursue this mystery to whatever end it demanded. Because the alternative was teaching Lily through his silence that some truths were better left buried, and that felt like the worst possible lesson for a father to offer a daughter who would need courage for whatever battles her own life would bring, and who deserved to know that her father had faced his, whatever the cost. Aurora Sterling's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower that reflected Dallas clouds with such perfection that reality and its reproduction became indistinguishable. A building that announced its dominance through height and transparency, while concealing everything that actually mattered behind tinted windows and security protocols that would have impressed military installations. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city's morning traffic congeal into gridlock patterns that from this altitude resembled circuit boards more than human movement, each vehicle a data point in systems too complex for individual drivers to comprehend. And she thought about control and its illusions, about how her entire career had been constructed on the premise that information and authority could master chaos, when in truth both were just more sophisticated forms of pretending, of arranging ignorance into shapes that looked like knowledge from certain angles. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who hadn't slept, whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide the tremor in her hands or the dark circles that makeup only partially concealed. And Aurora wondered when exactly she'd become this person who traded human connection for market position, who measured worth in quarterly returns and shareholder value, while some essential part of herself atrophied from disuse, becoming vestigial, like organs that evolution no longer required, because the environment had changed in ways that made vulnerability extinct and feeling dangerous. The intercom on her desk chirped with her assistant's voice, announcing the board meeting in 15 minutes. The quarterly review, where Aurora would present growth projections and strategic initiatives, while 20 men and 3 women evaluated whether her continued leadership served their interests or whether the company required new direction, a polite corporate phrase for termination and replacement. She'd prepared for weeks, knew every metric and talking point, could defend every decision with data that brooked no argument, and yet this morning the entire performance felt hollow. A theater where everyone pretended the scripts they read from emerged naturally, rather than from calculation and fear. and the desperate human need to believe that wealth accumulated according to merit rather than accident and exploitation, and the simple luck of being born into circumstances that allowed for education and opportunity instead of the grinding subsistence that defined most human lives. Aurora thought about Mason Cole in his grease-stained uniform, thought about the exhaustion in his eyes that matched her own despite their radically different contexts, and recognized something she'd been avoiding for years, that class distinctions were just another lie people told to organize suffering into hierarchies that made inequality feel like natural law instead of violence made systematic and bureaucratic, that her glass tower and his hangar were both prisons, just with different amenities and different guards and different names for the bars. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from corporate security, 2 from her general counsel, and a text from her ex-husband asking about their son's graduation ceremony next month, each notification a small invasion demanding response and attention. And Aurora felt the familiar claustrophobia of being CEO, of having no moment that wasn't subject to claims and obligations, and the relentless machinery of an organization that consumed her time and energy without ever offering satisfaction or rest. She thought about deleting everything, about walking out of this tower and disappearing into the kind of life where consequences were immediate rather than strategic, where danger wore obvious faces instead of hiding behind quarterly reports and corporate governance structures, and recognized the thought as fantasy, the kind of escape ideation that afflicted people who'd traded their souls for security, and then discovered security was just another word for comfortable captivity. But the fantasy persisted, especially now, with Mason's mystery calling her toward something real and dangerous and possibly destructive, offering the kind of engagement she'd systematically eliminated from her life in pursuit of control and achievement. Those hollow victories that looked impressive on business magazine covers, but felt like death by increments when she was alone in her penthouse, watching Dallas glitter below her like a constellation whose patterns had lost their meaning. The board meeting was exactly what she'd expected, men in expensive suits questioning her decisions with the particular condescension reserved for female executives who'd proven their competence so thoroughly that only their gender remained available for critique, coded in concerns about communication styles and team dynamics, and whether her leadership approach aligned with the company's collaborative culture. Phrases that meant nothing except that she made them uncomfortable with her clarity and her refusal to perform the emotional labor they expected from women in power. Aurora responded with data and projections, deflected their challenges with the precision of someone who'd learned early that any visible emotion would be weaponized, that anger became evidence of instability and tears proof of incompetence, that the only acceptable performance was perfect competence delivered with the warm approachability that made men feel comfortable even as she outperformed them in every measurable dimension. The meeting lasted 90 minutes, ending with grudging approval of her strategies and the implicit threat that next quarter's results would need to exceed projections, or else conversations about succession planning would become more explicit. And Aurora left the conference room feeling victorious and defeated simultaneously. Having won the battle while recognizing the war was unwinnable because the rules changed whenever she approached mastery. She returned to her office to find an envelope on her desk marked confidential with no return address, and Aurora's hands shook slightly as she opened it, some instinct warning that whatever it contained would accelerate the unraveling that had begun last night in the hangar with Mason's impossible signature. Inside was a single photograph, grainy and slightly out of focus, showing 2 figures in what appeared to be an aircraft cabin, one unmistakably Aurora herself, younger by 3 years but recognizable, and the other, a man whose face was turned away, but whose posture and build matched Mason Cole's exactly. Their heads bent together over something Aurora couldn't see in the frame. their body language suggesting intimacy or conspiracy, or both. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in precise block letters, "Some debts compound interest when ignored." And below that, a phone number with no area code, no context, just 10 digits that might lead anywhere or nowhere. Aurora felt her professional facade crack completely, the corporate armor she'd worn all morning suddenly inadequate against whatever this was. This intrusion into her constructed reality that suggested surveillance and threat and knowledge, held by parties unknown, entities that could reach into her supposedly secure office and leave evidence of past actions she couldn't remember. Warnings about consequences for events her conscious mind refused to acknowledge, but her autonomic nervous system recognized as authentic and dangerous. She photographed the envelope and its contents with shaking hands, texted Mason the images, along with a message that abandoned all corporate distance. "They know we're looking, which means we're already in danger. Which means we have to move faster than they expect, or we'll disappear into whatever mechanism erased us the first time." Aurora looked at the phone number on the photograph's reverse, traced the digits with one finger as if touch could reveal their destination, and made a decision that violated every principle of caution and strategic thinking she'd built her career upon. She dialed the number directly, bypassed her security team and legal counsel, ignored every protocol designed to protect executives from extortion and manipulation. Because Mason had been right last night when he'd chosen knowledge over safety, because living in ignorance meant living as someone else's puppet, and Aurora Sterling had spent 41 years being controlled by various forms of authority and expectation and fear. And if this moment offered any chance of breaking those strings, then she would take it, even if the cost was everything she'd accumulated in her glass tower, even if the truth waiting at the other end of this phone call destroyed the careful fiction of her life, because at least destruction would be hers, chosen rather than imposed. And that distinction suddenly mattered more than quarterly earnings or board approval, or any of the metrics she'd mistaken for meaning during her long climb to an altitude where oxygen thinned and human connection became impossible to sustain. Aurora confronts the contradiction between agency and erasure. The voice insists they volunteered, that waivers were signed, that they consented to the removal of the 3 days because the technical knowledge they'd gained was classified beyond civilian purview. This claim collides with her lived sense of self, boardrooms, carefully curated calendars, a life of decisions made consciously and visibly, and with Mason's greasy, honest reality. Both feel manipulated by a narrative that now tricks them into retrofitting purpose around their missing hours. The caller mentions a third party, a shadow outside the original containment, and the implication is immediate and terrifying. Someone else knows, or at least suspects, what happened, and that leak has turned their past into a present vulnerability. The voice provides coordinates for a meeting at a decommissioned Fort Worth facility, insists on no electronics, and leaves them staring at a future that trades the false safety of enforced ignorance for the unpredictable danger of awareness. Mason, reeling from the hangar discovery and the photograph in Aurora's office, answers Aurora's message with the same mix of anger and resolve he showed when he first saved the black box audio. He moves to place Lily with his mother in Houston so he can confront whatever this is without subjecting his child to the fog of surveillance and potential reprisal. His messages reveal the domestic stakes that tether him. The moral calculus is different for a single father than it is for an isolated CEO. Still, his determination to know, his refusal to remain an edited version of himself, defines his decision. Aurora, for her part, toggles between executive caution and something older and fiercer, a refusal to let others define the perimeter of her life without her consent. They meet at the Fort Worth facility at dawn and are processed like liabilities rather than guests. frisked, stripped of devices, walk down hallways that smell of disuse and government thrift. Dr. Whitmore, the man whose voice came through the call, operates with a scholar's cadence and an intelligence officer's patience. He presents footage and documents that are at once intimate and disorienting. The video shows them, 3 years younger and unhampered by the walls they've subsequently built, working in a classified lab, exhausted and exhilarated, solving a problem whose contours neither fully remembered. The footage reconstructs the work. Mason's practical engineering and Aurora's strategic mapping combined to identify and patch a vulnerability in commercial navigation systems that hostile actors exploited for surveillance, a threat the public could not be permitted to know about for fear of panic and method exposure. Seeing themselves on screen is an act of violent discovery. They watch moments of competence and warmth that feel like stolen archives of lives that were temporarily theirs. Mason is surprised by his own command of technical language, by how engaged and purposeful he looks when the camera captures him in the flow of problem-solving rather than the weary labor of hangar nights. Aurora recognizes a version of herself who was less defensive and more alive, someone who used her influence to do something concrete and life-preserving rather than accrue abstract metrics. The footage also makes the ethical trade-off visible. What they achieved apparently saved lives and secured the national fleet. But the bureaucracy decided that saving those lives justified erasing the savior's memories. Watching the goodbye scene before suppression, when they joke about what to remember, when they touch each other's hands in a cramped laboratory, both mourns and honors what the program took. Dr. Whitmore explains the program's rationale, its moral compromises, and the bureaucratic fear that made suppression seem the only rational option 3 years ago. Then he pivots to the present problem. Someone outside the program stole partial records and is trying to weaponize the knowledge. That leak transformed a contained operation into a liability because the third party can now trace participants. Official protection is impossible without acknowledging the classified work itself, which would open far worse doors. Unofficial measures can be arranged but come with limits and deniability. He offers them a stark choice: re-enter suppression with a newer, cleaner wipe and safety that is official, but erases authorship. Or keep the memories, accept the danger of being targets for hostile intelligence and private predators, and receive a different kind of shield in the form of encrypted documentation and a dead man's switch designed to make their exposure costly to anyone who would harm them. The moral axis of the story centers on autonomy versus manufactured safety. Mason's instinct, honed by years of being told what his life should fit into, pushes him toward refusal. He will not accept being made into an instrument whose strings are cut by anonymous handlers. Aurora, whose entire career taught her that control is power, finds in Mason's stubbornness the courage she needs to choose freedom even if freedom means vulnerability. Their private stakes differ, Lily for Mason, a son and corporate legacy for Aurora, yet both recognize the indignity of being stripped of their agency. The choice they make is less a tactical calculation than a reclaiming of personhood. They opt to remember, to be dangerous with knowledge, to weigh the price of truth against the erasure of self. Dr. Whitmore complies with a mixture of resignation and respect. He gives them encrypted drives, procedural contacts, contingency protocols, and the dead man's switch that will release classified files if either of them is harmed. He frames these measures as a form of crude mutual deterrence, make the cost of eliminating them so high that enemies will think twice. It's an imperfect shield, legal, reputational, and literal danger remain, but it's enough framework to allow Mason and Aurora to act publicly on their own terms rather than under someone else's forgetful authority. In the same session, they see the financial truth behind their sudden stability. Payments and anonymous investments were designed to re-suture their lives materially after the theft of memory. Compensation for the human cost of being erased. Money that bought them shoes and expansions, but not the memories themselves. They emerge from the facility altered. The Dallas skyline looks the same, but both carry a new chronology inside their heads. The revelation reshapes Mason's grief into context. The ache he couldn't name now has an origin. His partial competencies, his afternoons of exhaustion and sudden bursts of insight are not failures, but remnants of an identity reclaimed. Aurora carries the paradox of success and theft. Her empire built upon competence, but perhaps partly enabled by intervention she doesn't remember taking. The emotional recalibration between them is immediate and strange. They are returned to a version of intimacy they had been forced to abandon, and the urgency of shared danger tightens an unexpected bond. They plan to test whether their past connection can live in present light, whether the chemistry the footage showed will survive the bureaucratic scarring. Mason returns to Houston lighter, oddly buoyed, despite the catalogue of threats appended to his name. Knowledge, he realizes, is a strange kind of relief. He tells Lily an age-appropriate truth about complicated grown-up work, and promises her that whatever else changes, she remains the priority. The decision to face danger consciously becomes for him a lesson about dignity and honesty. He will not teach his daughter that safety bought by surrender is preferable to the truth bought at risk. Aurora, meanwhile, navigates her tower with different eyes. The confidentiality and power she once used like armor now feel like camouflage for a life she did not fully authorize. The photograph left on her desk and the anonymous calls are now seen through the lens of systemic decisions that used them as instruments. They attempt a normal life, awkward, beautiful, and tentative. A 3-day interlude later, they meet in public as two people who share a secret that is also a vulnerability. The date is uneven. Conversation circles around the recorded past, around ordinary subjects like children and regrets, around trying to relearn each other without the original stitching of those days. Laughter returns because it had been visible in the footage and therefore possible in the present. It is both rehearsed and genuine. In small ways, handholds, shared glances, they begin the labor of building something that isn't administratively assigned or suppressed, a choice to be together that neither program sanctioned. The narrative concludes not with a neat resolution of all external threats, but with the moral and relational closure the characters need. Mason and Aurora choose autonomy and mutual support over the false shelter of enforced forgetting. They accept the practical consequences, surveillance, the risk of being targeted, the bureaucratic headache of living as people who know what they should not. In exchange, they reclaim authorship of their lives and of the memory of the days when they were fully themselves. Dr. Whitmore's files and the dead man's switch provide an imperfect but usable safeguard. More importantly, the decision to remember changes how they understand courage, parenthood, leadership, and intimacy. The last image is intimate rather than cinematic. Father and daughter reuniting in Houston with a new, complicated truth, now part of their story. A CEO leaving a glass tower to wear boots and jeans in a parking lot where she cries and is consoled by a mechanic she once forgot. Two people who were used and then paid to forget, instead choosing to inherit the consequences of their own choices. Their future is ambiguous, dangerous, and fragile, but finally theirs. The cost of knowledge is high, and the road ahead is dangerous, yet they walk it with open eyes, shoulder to shoulder, refusing the convenience of living as someone else's comfortable secret.